Hello, my name is Abby Lovett. I'm with the University of Florida's Sam Proctor Oral History Program. Today's date is March 5th, 2021. I'm at my home in Gainesville, Florida, and today I'm joined by Ben Montgomery, award-winning author, former Tampa Bay Times reporter, and current co-editor of Axios Tampa. Mr. Montgomery, could you please state your name and date of birth for the record?
My name is Benjamin Andrew Montgomery, and I was born January 1st, 1978.
A New Year's baby. That's fun. Okay, so where were you born?
Tulsa, Oklahoma, St. Francis Hospital.
Okay, and were you raised in Oklahoma?
I was born and raised. I left there for school in Arkansas in 1996.
Okay, all right. Let's backtrack a little bit and talk about who were your parents? What were they like? Were they married? Do you have a single mom? What was that like?
Yeah, my parents were married when I was born. My mother, Donna Montgomery, was a housewife. I was the third of three boys. I was born in a very small town called Slick, Oklahoma. The hospital was in Tulsa, but the town we lived in was called Slick, an old oil and gas town with one stop sign.
Hence the name.
Yeah, I was the youngest of three. My older brother, Paul, is 8 years older than I am. My middle brother, Matthew, is 5 years older than I am. My father at the time was a Southern Baptist preacher. He had graduated from seminary and was a preacher at the First Baptist Church of Slick, Oklahoma. And when I was a little guy, 3 or 4 years old, we relocated from Slick to a suburb of Oklahoma City called Del City, where my dad took over as pastor at a Baptist church. And then eventually we relocated to Moore, which is south of Oklahoma City. And that's what I think of as my hometown. That's where I spent for most of my formative years. My dad, interestingly, married another woman. He began, he was bivocational. So he was preaching on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights. And then in the week, he would drive a truck. He was a long haul trucker, drove a semi. And he met and married another woman while he was married to my mother. So wow. He started a second family in Missouri that my mother and me and my brothers weren't privy to until he was sort of found out. And my mother filed for divorce. They split up. He moved full-time to Missouri. This all happened when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old.
Wow.
And so for a few years, my mom was raising me and my brothers. And she was working at a daycare center in the daytime and then at a Taco Bell in off hours. And then on weekends, she was cleaning churches. And I have memories of helping her do that, like running the vacuum cleaner at, this one big church in South Oklahoma City. And then eventually she met and married a man that I've come to think of as my dad, although he's my stepdad. His name was John Burris. They got married in April of 1988 and are still married today. And so I had the good fortune of having a very stable, good guy as a fill-in dad.
Right. Well, that's all very interesting. I was going to say your mother, you said she was a housewife, so that must have been a very tough transition for her. And that's just incredible that she managed to pull you and your brothers through that. So was she an inspiration to you? Yes.
Absolutely. An inspiration and is an inspiration to this day. I think of her as my best friend. We talk about every other day. She is a confidant, an advisor, and, a very good mother on top of all that.
Right. That's awesome. So does she still live in Oklahoma now? Or is she? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. South Oklahoma City.
Okay, great. So let's talk about your education in Oklahoma, just high school, middle school. What was that like? What were your interests? Were you in any clubs?
Yeah. So I went to a Christian school that was affiliated with a Southern Baptist church, kindergarten through fifth grade. My mother um, was sort of a manager a little bit at an affiliated daycare center. And so we got free tuition to this, what would be considered a private school, I guess. So early education was, reading, writing, arithmetic, and Bible studies. I remember starting every day by saying all the books of the Bible, in order. It was just rote memorization. I remember having chapel on Wednesdays. So we would leave class and all gather in the whole school would get together in a chapel, and we would hear some sort of sermon or a parable. And so church was kind of like a big part of life. We went to church Sunday morning and Sunday night, and on Wednesday nights, and then got a lot of religious education in school as well. When my mom remarried, my oldest brother had already graduated from that school. My middle brother and I both transferred into public schools, me into the sixth grade, and he probably would have been going to the 10th or 11th grade. That was at an elementary school. It was brand new to me. My education, it feels like in retrospect, was perhaps a little better than the kids in the public school had gotten. Primarily, I say that only because I knew everything that they were being taught. Like I already picked it up. And so sixth grade was kind of a pause year for me. It wasn't a lot I was learning new. It was mostly stuff that I had already learned. And as a result of that, I kind of stood out. I won the, Masonic Award, which was like the top award for a sixth grader at Southgate Elementary or whatever.
Okay.
And then into junior high, I played soccer. That was my main extracurricular activity all growing up. When I got into junior high, I started playing basketball and football as well. And so junior high was, a sort of uneventful. I just remember, being aware of girls for the first time and being conscious of the things I was wearing for the first time and like the brands of clothes and into high school, my identity sort of became aligned with athletics more, maybe. School came very easy to me. I made good grades in almost all of my classes. I don't remember ever doing any homework or really being especially studious. I was mostly interested in what kind of shenanigans I was going to get up into on the weekends.
Right.
And girls and sports. Were
you still playing soccer and football?
I stopped playing soccer for a couple of years, but then started again in my sophomore or junior year of high school, and I lettered in 3 sports.
Wow. And basketball too?
Basketball, football, and soccer.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and my senior year, I guess in the spring of my senior year, I signed a scholarship or a letter of intent to play football at Arkansas Tech University. I had no real ambition that I can recall of like going into college. It just wasn't, I guess I sort of figured I would, but it wasn't like a goal. I thought
even though you were such a good student.
Yeah, but it wasn't, I didn't necessarily even really have much ambition except I thought I might. My grandpa he'd retired from the Air Force, and he was very focused on education. In fact, he had a doctorate of engineering from Oklahoma State University, and he had been in the Air Force for most of his life. And he was on some teams of engineers that did some amazing design projects. But so he always preached education to us. But I wanted nothing more than to go to Slick after high school and help him run cows on a farm. He had about 350 acres in Slick, Oklahoma, right near his own birthplace. And my brother, Paul, my oldest brother, took a great interest in, helping him with that farm. And so we would go on the weekends and work all weekend long and then come back to the city. And my primary ambition was, for career wise, was like be a cowboy or a farmer.
Yeah, true man of the West, I can see.
Yeah. So when I went off to college at Arkansas Tech, I left behind this girl who, in fact, I had met in 8th grade. Her name was Jennifer, and we dated in the 8th grade, and then broke up and took some years apart. But we were always friends, and then we started dating again my senior year of high school. Aww. So when I left to go to college, which was only 4 hours down Interstate 40 from Oklahoma City, I missed her very badly, and I've tried to go home on weekends, but it was hard. And so after one semester of college, this would have been, the Christmas of 1996, I came back home and asked her to marry me.
Oh.
And she said yes, but she said that she didn't want to be a farmer's wife. She didn't want to live in Slick, Oklahoma. She wanted to live in New York City, and she had the ambition of like going to the Fashion Institute of Technology, which was on her radar.
Wow.
So I needed
very different directions there.
But my major at Tech was agriculture business.
Oh, really? Not journalism?
Not at first. But I realized because of that I needed another career, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I took a class that was a substitute. It was like a credit for English, but it was called feature writing.
Sure.
And it was the first writing class that I had ever taken, I think. I mean, I'd done writing and other classes in high school, but this was the first serious writing class I had taken. And the text that we used was a collection of very well done narrative feature stories from newspaper writers across the country. And I remember being surprised that that these true stories could give me the same feelings that like the best fiction did, because I always thought newspapers were just news, and this was eye-opening in that regard. And so I did the first real assignment that we had. It was like the 3,000-word story on a topic of your choice, and I did it, and I turned it in, and the professor read the top of it in class the next time, and he was like, "This is how we should all be doing this." And it was this moment for me that was affirming. And from then on, I was like, okay, I'm going to be a writer now. And so I threw myself into it, started working at the local paper, started working at the student paper, started designing and editing the Florida Fish and Wildlife magazine, which was like a volunteer role.
From Arkansas?
Yeah.
To Florida. Okay. Interesting. So I see you have like a lot of interest in history. Did you study history at all in college, or did that come about later?
Not so much. I do remember there was a very good history teacher. He taught Western civilization, and his name was Dr. Link, and he had big, long, yellow fingernails.
Oh.
He sort of had the appearance of a hobo, and he used to walk around campus, and he would always wear heavy coats and heavy hats, and even in the summertime, and like a raggedy briefcase. But he was one of these kind of eccentric and fiery, passionate teachers of history. And so maybe I was interested, but I didn't, it certainly wasn't like a big focus at the time. Right. I learned around that time, though, that that storytelling was perhaps in my blood, like maybe not written storytelling, but all my people did for entertainment was get around and talk and tell stories. And that's how they got along. It's how I remember growing up, spending summers with my granny in Slick, and we would go sit on the back porch swing, and she would just tell me story after story about growing up and the Depression and, the trouble she got up to. And, and I realized at some point that like that, what I was doing is just putting that on the page, finding characters that were appealing and a plot figuring out what motivated people, what they were after, and then set them on that course and, structure all the facts in a way that allow for character development and the coverage of chronology and rising action and all those things that we know about from fiction. Just doing it in with facts, in truth.
Right.
So I started working at the Russellville, Arkansas Courier. My first real newspaper job after I graduated from Arkansas Tech was at the San Angelo Standard-Times in San Angelo, Texas. Okay. And I was there for about a year and then moved to the Times-Herald-Record in upstate New York just before 9/11.
Wow.
And was there for about 4.5 or 5 years and then got a job at the Tampa Tribune. And I was there for about 10 months before I got hired away by what was then the St. Petersburg Times.
Right.
And that's where I spent from March of 2006 until the end of 2017.
Wow. And now you're doing well, we'll get into that later. But I wanted to say, so how did you end up, was it just the job at the Tribune that got you to Florida, or was there something else that was a motivation? Because I know your wife wanted to live in New York. So how did you end up the opposite side of the East Coast?
Yeah, she did want to live in New York, but then we realized how hard it is to live in New York. And she had all sorts of ideas. She wanted to be after she abandoned the idea of going to the Fashion Institute of Technology, she decided she was going to be a New York City police officer.
Oh.
She went through all the training for that and then realized that there was a requirement. They had to wear the hat. And she didn't wear the hat.
That was it. That was what, after all that.
Yeah, she passed the physical test and the mental test and, psych eval and all that. And then was, like, I don't want to wear the hat. So, I became aware, the Times-Herald-Record is a cool place because it's run by this really interesting guy named Mike Levine, who was a storyteller. And Mike had hired a bunch of younger, talented reporters, including Brendan Scott, who now runs the Asia Bureau for Bloomberg News, Michael Cruz, who's the enterprise reporter for Politico, a lot of really talented people. And we developed this like healthy competition among one another. Like we would get together and talk stories all the time. And we started going to conferences together. And at some point in there, Michael Cruz, he's my best friend. He and I learned about the reputation of the St. Petersburg Times, which was owned by the Poynter Institute for Media Studies in St. Pete. So it's a nonprofit that owns a for-profit newspaper. And it was a paper that for decades had been doing like really the best long-form narrative journalism in the country. People like David Finkel and Anna Hull and Rick Bragg and Kelly Benham and Tom French and John Barry and all these highly regarded feature writers. And so Michael and I were like, let's go there. We want to work at that place. And Michael got in, but I couldn't get on their radar. And so a job came open at the Tribune. The editor for that job was a guy that had edited me in New York. He knew me. So as soon as he got that job and he had an opening, I was like, hey, let me get that. And he was like, all right, come on down. So I thought I'll go to the Trib and beat the Times as often as I can, on the same story, because we're covering the same stuff. I'll just beat them until they have to hire me. And
until they notice, yes.
Yeah, that's how it worked.
So and that worked, that strategy?
Yeah, it
clearly
6 months. Yeah.
Right.
I thought it would take longer, but it was pretty quick that I got a meeting with one of their top guys, Mike Wilson, who's now sports editor at the New York Times.
Wow.
Mike very quickly extended an offer, and I joined the Brandon Bureau of the St. Petersburg Times.
Okay. And so what kind of stories were you writing about? Well, first I'll ask, what kind of stories were you writing about when you were having your Tribune Times kind of competition? And then what did you switch to writing about once you started, or were you writing about the same thing?
I was covering cops and courts for the Trib. And it wasn't so much the big stories, although there were big stories that time. Deborah LaFave had just gotten arrested for sex with a middle school student. She was this sort of typically beautiful teacher who had gotten to a long relationship with an eighth grader. Mm-hmm. I covered Hurricane Katrina for the Trib. We went up to the Gulf Coast and, but I liked the idea of like plucking out these daily stories about people making big mistakes, which mostly is why people wind up getting arrested, and diving into them and exploring what factors were at play that made otherwise normal, regular people commit heinous acts or terrible mistakes. And so, a lot of them wouldn't be memorable to anybody except the people involved, but I would kind of plunge into them and make them come alive, if you will. Right. And so when I got hired at the Times, it's kind of doing the same sorts of things. Although my first job, I got hired by Mike Wilson, who was the enterprise editor at the Times, but you have to pay your dues at the Times. And so I had to do a year in the Brandon Bureau, which was kind of the far eastern reaches of the St. Pete Times coverage area. And so the first day on the job, the editor there, David Karp, called me into his office and he was like, "So we don't really need you. We don't have coverage. We don't have an area of coverage for you. So why don't you pick your beat?" And he gave me a 24 or 48 hours to think about it. And I came back and I was like, "I want to cover loneliness, choices and consequences, and human collision." And these aren't typical newspaper beats.
Right. No, not at all. I thought you were going to say sports or crime. Or
yeah. But it's kind of like how I wanted to look at the prism through which I wanted to try to see stories. And so Karp, to his credit, was like, I remember pushing back and kind of laughing for a little bit. And then he said, "Fantastic. And can you also cover Ruskin?" And I was like, all right. So for a year, my beat was loneliness, choices and consequences, human collision, and the town of Ruskin in eastern Hillsborough County. And it was fantastic. And so, I was doing stories that got me on 1A primarily, stories that I could take and make bigger than they actually were, if that makes sense.
I see, like stories that wouldn't get picked up normally, but that did have import.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And for instance.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think it.
Sorry. For instance.
You're good.
There was I was driving down Highway 60 once, and I noticed these people had pulled off on the side of the road, and they were kind of walking out in this beautiful field of sunflowers. And it was only like maybe 10 acres or something but the sunflowers had just popped and they were gorgeous. And there was a lady who had set up an easel and she was painting, like plein air painting the sunflowers. And I thought, this is a story. And so, I talked to the folks there and called up the farmer who had planted the sunflowers. And it turns out, he didn't really care about sunflowers, but he had to have a cover crop in between strawberry crops to prevent erosion. And normally he planted iron clay peas, which are a very simple crop, but they're all green and they stay low to the ground and they prevent erosion and help re-nourish the soil and things like that. And his wife was like, "Why don't you plant sunflowers this time?" And so he just, all right, whatever. And he went and he planted sunflowers, and then they turned into this special thing. And so I just wrote the shit out of it. I made it like poetry, and it was 300 words, maybe less than that. And I wrote it onto 1A. A story like that would rarely make the front page of the St. Petersburg Times in those days. But I sold it with this passion, and people appreciated it. Like, readers loved it. So I would do that all the time, or as often as I could. Pretty soon got hired as an enterprise reporter on the enterprise staff. So I was headquartered in St. Pete and working with like the best writers at the paper.
Okay, awesome. So what time period, do you know what year you were hired by the Times?
Yeah, it was March of 2006.
March of 2006. Okay. So then, obviously, a couple of years later, Carol Marvin Miller published her article, which was sort of the first major expose on Dozier. And then later, you co-authored a multi-part series called For Their Own Good, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist with Waveney and Moore. I was wondering, how did we get here? How did you find out about Dozier? And was it through that Carol Marvin Miller piece, or was there another way you got your first impression?
I missed Karen Marvin Miller's story. I didn't see it when it came out. The first time Dozier was on my radar, I was sitting at my desk in the St. Pete Times newsroom, and I was reading the paper, and it was in the morning. And I feel like we had a staff meeting later, a little bit later. And so I was just passing time, drinking a cup of coffee and reading the paper. And in the back, I think maybe on the back page of the Metro section, this would have been like October 20th or something, 21st maybe of 2008. On the back of the Metro section, we had an AP story, Dateline Mariana. Mm-hmm. And it was, I think Brendan Farrington had covered a little press conference that had been held the day before on the campus of the Florida School for Boys, which was then the, what's it called? The Dozier School?
Arthur G. Dozier School.
Yeah. They changed the name shortly after that again. But anyways, it was coverage of that first, these five guys who had kind of met and found each other online and had convinced the state to let them have a ceremony.
Right. And
the state, with the help of Gus Barrero, who's a former legislator from South Florida, who had become sort of a high-ranking guy in the Department of Juvenile Justice, was a child advocate. He had enabled them to have this little ceremony that was only attended by a handful of officials with DJJ and also by some members of the press. And when these guys, they were all given the opportunity to talk, and they told of their experiences at Dozier, which for some of them included being whipped until their backside split open. And, they, as I recall, in that story, they recalled seeing blood on the walls, and after the ceremony, they had all gone across the street to this little cemetery, and the story hinted at there being mysteries in this cemetery. Nobody knew how many people were buried there and that sort of thing. And so it was those quotes that grabbed my attention in that first AP story. And I was blown away that we had never heard of this. And my story radar is almost always on, unless I'm, really chilling out on the weekend or something. But I remember walking that paper over to the desk of my editor, Kelly Benham, who to this day is my best friend. And I threw it down on her desk with that story facing up. And I always when I get excited, I like grab my dog tooth and I was doing this, and I was like,
yeah.
And she knew she needed to read that. So she started reading it, and her eyes just got wider and wider and wider. And I was like, we should do this and do it right. And she was like, go do it. And so, I think that day I made a phone call to Robert Straley, who was
right.
One of the original five guys. And he was in our area. He lived in Clearwater, Florida. And so I phoned him up and introduced myself. And I told him that I think I had Googled Dozier and of course read Carol's story that day, I think. But I told him I want to do this, and I want to do it better than it's ever been done. And I want to do it right. And I want to take my time with it. And I want to get to the truth of the situation, because if you recall, and Carol did a wonderful job breaking this whole thing open. But there was still a lot of question about whether what these men were saying was true. And I thought if these five guys had that experience and they just sort of random or coincidentally found each other online, there are going to be a lot more guys. Unbeknownst to me, that very day, two men came into the St. Pete Times newsroom and said, "Can I talk to a reporter?" And they were passed off to Waveney Ann Moore, my colleague who covered community news in St. Petersburg. And Waveney interviewed them with the idea that she would write a story about them. Well, both of them had been at the Dozier School when they were kids, and both of them recalled, one white, one black, both of them recalled the terrible beatings they took and beatings that their classmates took, their peers took. And they remembered how horrible that experience was for them. And one of the guys, George Chloe, said that it had ruined his life. You know, he'd been in and out of prison since then. He blamed all of his subsequent experiences with the law, distrust for the law, hatred of society, hatred of the system, on that one experience in his formative years as a kid being beaten at the Dozier School. And so Waveney and I talked either the next day or a couple of days later. I told Robert Straley that day on the phone, I was like, anybody who calls you, because they had set up a website, you know, and I think Robert's number was on the website. So anybody who gets in touch with you, just put them in touch with me or give them my phone number and tell them I want to talk. And so before long, I was interviewing these guys on the phone with the idea that we would go interview them in person later, but it was just sort of a trial run. And it was almost to a man. The experience went like, I'm Ben Montgomery. I'm working on a story about the Dozier School. I understand you were there. Yeah, I was there. Take me back and tell me what it's like. And then they would talk sometimes for 30 minutes without interruption, sometimes for longer, and they would cry. Mm-hmm. And I would just sit silently on the phone listening to these guys who, for the very first time, many of them in their whole lives, were telling another human about their experience at that school. And so those first phone calls were just me listening, you know, like hardly asking any questions at all, just saying, I'm sorry. I hear you, you know, those sorts of things. We started to realize like, this is a big deal. The number of men just in a few days' time had grown from 5 to, 30. And so we decided we were going to try to interview as many people as possible. I think for the first story, which ran in April of 2009. So what is that? 5 months after Carol broke the story and after the AP ran that little story. I think we had talked to somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 different men who had all shared that very similar experience of being beaten at Dozier. And we plunged into the historical archive, which was full of stories about how terrible this place was, going all the way back to, 1906, when investigators showed up from Tallahassee to check out how things were going at the new industrial school. And they found kids as young as 6 years old locked in irons like common criminals. Through, the fire in the 19-teens that killed who knows how many boys and a couple of staff members, to the scandalous behavior of the personnel over the years, all the way through the 40s and 50s and 60s and the terribleness of that. And then, through the mid 1980s when the school was trying to settle the Bobby M lawsuit, which accused school people of hog tying kids and leaving them in isolation for, weeks and weeks. And just a long history of cyclical abuse and neglect.
So I wanted to ask about that, because obviously in my research process, I've read about all these things and their long history as well. And I found the first newspaper article I found specifically reporting on White House beatings was 1968 or 1969. So this had been going on and people had known about it for so long. Do you have any theories on why it took until 2008, 2009 for this to really come to light?
Yeah. I think primarily because we as a culture and as a society change pretty often, even though that change doesn't always happen overnight. It feels gradual. And, but, we went to war in 1865 over slavery, right? And half the country thought it was okay. And I challenge you to find a person alive that thinks it's okay today. So our feelings about that level of corporal punishment have changed dramatically. But when stories of abuse and corporal punishment being carried to the extreme preceded 1968. I think it all sort of started to come about in 1968 because of some testimony by a former psychologist at the school, Dr. Eugene Bird, who told a Senate subcommittee that he had witnessed some of these beatings and that they were brutal and that they went beyond the norm of corporal punishment. What is her name? It turns out Janet Reno's mother, whose name is escaping me right now, she was a muckraking investigative journalist for the Miami News when that paper still existed. And in, I want to say 1955, she went up to the school to do a series on the school. And she talked to kids who had been beaten and who told her about these terrible beatings that caused their behinds to split open and so forth. And she challenged the school on that. And they justified it, saying, these aren't the best boys. These boys need to be disciplined like that and that sort of thing. But that was a sensational story, and it scandalized the school. And that was 1955. So a couple of different things. One, we change culturally. We change in terms of what acceptable behavior is, what acceptable punishment is. Thank God, we're all the time changing. So those types of beatings weren't so uncommon in 1968 as to be shocking to the senses. But also, this has forever, juvenile delinquents, troubled kids have forever been a completely overlooked demographic. They have zero political power. They don't vote. They are easily ignored until they cause crime and destroy lives. Right. But if they're locked up, you don't see them, you don't hear from them unless there are, muckraking journalists who are doing their jobs and exploring the conditions in places like this. But otherwise, they get no information out. They don't know how to access the courts. They don't know how to access activist networks that can help talk about injustice that they experience. And
they don't know if anyone even cares. That was the impression I got, was a lot of people thought these kids had been abandoned. A lot of them didn't have parents, were orphans. They thought no one cares about me.
And at Dozier in particular, they were threatened upon leaving the school. The staff would say, we know where you live. We know your name. We know how to come find you. And if you tell anybody about this, you'll be right back here. And God Almighty, imagine being 12 or 13 years old and having been beaten like that and then being sent away with that sort of a threat. I'm going to believe it. You know what I mean? And I'm going to do everything I can not to get back to that place and to face the revenge that they might, carry out. And so that's a lot of them shut up about it, tried to forget it, put it in their past. Of course, we know that doesn't happen. Childhood trauma is not something you can forget about. It manifests itself in a million different ways, including destructive behavior, including alcoholism and drug abuse, and including physical ailments that we don't even necessarily associate with childhood trauma. There's lots of research that shows that childhood trauma can manifest as back pain and physical ailments, migraine headaches, things like that. So a lot of these guys, they had very clear signs of dealing with that trauma for years. Some of them, after they got out of Dozier, could never sleep with the lights off again. Some of them wet the bed for the rest of their lives. It went all the way from that to guys who said, Dozier was good for me. I needed that, to guys who, Bryant Middleton, who is an Army Ranger and served in Vietnam and got a Purple Heart, told me he would go back to Vietnam before he would go back to the Dozier School for Boys, which is
we actually interviewed him. Our program did.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
And I'm not surprised. I heard similar sentiments. So.
Yeah. There's a guy named Stu Kruger, and this is the most impactful. It was in that first story that we did, but I interviewed Stu down in Miami, and I was like, he's a smart guy. And he had been in finance, I think, stock trader, something like that. But he'd been through 5 or 6 marriages and had some kids who didn't talk to him anymore. And I was like, what do you think the long-term effects of Dozier were? And he talked about some of that. He was like, I can't be loved. I can't give love. I can't be loved. That's always been a challenge for me. And it's caused me a number of, I hurt people and it's caused me a number of failed marriages. But he said, I've never told anybody this before. Gosh, I remember this like it was yesterday. He said, I've never told anybody about this before, but he said when we were, he had made it to ace, which was the highest rank of kid that you could. So you got a lot of special privileges if you became an ace. You were a leader, you were well behaved, and all that stuff. And so he made it to the rank of ace, and he and his buddy, who was also an ace, got to go to the movies on a Saturday, and with some other aces. And so they all walked into town, a couple of miles into town. They watched the movie, The River, A Bridge Over the River Kwai. And they were walking back, and he and his friend had decided they were going to run away that day. And so when the guard wasn't looking, he and his buddy ducked off into the woods and made a run for it. And they ran as far and as fast as they could, but they got caught. And when they got caught, and by the way, the staff used to openly call it boy hunting. We're going boy hunting.
And use tracking dogs and
brought in dog boys from ACI, the Appalachia Correctional Institute. Anyways, they caught Stu and his friend. They brought him back to the White House for a beating. And Stu's buddy went in first. And Stu told me that he was sitting outside, in the front room of that building. And he heard his friend screaming for his mother. And he said it was so crushing in the moment, just hearing his buddy scream, that he was so scared that he bent over and he picked up a tiny pebble off the ground. And he said, I concentrated all of my being, all of my energy into that pebble. And I just rolled it in between my fingers and I put myself into that pebble. And he said, it helped me get through that moment, hearing my friend scream. And he reached into his pocket and pulled out this tiny white pebble and held it in the palm of his hand to show us. And he goes, 50 fucking years later, I can't be comfortable without this pebble. And so still, when he gets nervous, he pulls out that pebble that he's had that long and rolls it in between his fingers. It's the only way he knows how to cope with things. So, that's the manifestation of childhood trauma. You don't get past it. Some people learn how to cope and become productive citizens, but this place made monsters out of a lot of people and caused unmeasurable pain for Florida families, not just those families of men who got out of there, but also the families that were victim of crime committed by those same men who did not get reformed at the reformatory, who instead got fucked up.
Damaged, yes, even more. Yeah. So I wanted to say it was sort of this forgotten story for so long. All these things happened and it just got pushed to the back of Floridians' minds, in this little panhandle town. Why do you think people cared so much when this story came out? I mean, it was a huge news. I remember hearing about it. I was 9 or 10 or 11 years old. And I remember hearing about it and reading about it and just being absolutely taken with the fact that I grew up in Pensacola, Florida. So this was practically in my backyard and I couldn't believe it. Why do you think people were so taken with this story?
A couple of reasons. First, and this sounds braggish and I don't mean it to, but we did the story right in the sense that we made it accessible to readers with limited time by the way that we just chose to write it. And it was a long and thoughtful journey from the reporting to the finished product. And it included outlining the thing a half dozen times on big sheets of paper that we pasted around the walls of a room that we took over, revising that outline, and then writing with my colleague Waveney and Moore, writing that story in a way that made it readable, true, and impactful. And then when that ran and we heard back from a ton of people, we had a conversation about how everybody in the past had done the same thing that we just did. The St. Pete Times, in fact, in the 60s had written a story called Hell's 1,400 Acres that was really well done. And it was a one-off story, and it let people forget about this. And so we decided in the weeks after that first story ran, and really maybe even before that, because we were already planning number 2, we decided we are not going to let this go as a newspaper. And we are going to not just write one story that talks about what happened in the 1950s and 60s, but we're going to write a story about what things are like today. We're going to cover the school as if it was a beat, even though it's 300 miles away from St. Pete, Florida. They're going to send me and Edmund and Waveney up as often as we need to go up. So we did story after story after story after story for, 7 or 8 years. That first piece ran in April of 2009. The school closed in June of 2011, but we probably did, 24 stories in between that first one and when the state finally, maybe more than that, when the state finally decided to close it, and then kept writing about it. Right.
I was going to say it didn't stop either.
Because there's so many mysteries about that cemetery. Like the FDLE closed their case. And I remember reading that report, kind of making the same trip over to my editor's desk and throwing that report down in front of her and being like, this is bullshit. This gives us no answers. They're guessing. They say they can't do GPR. I didn't know anything about GPR, but I was like, how can you not? It's these are the questions that we have. It's a field. Run your stuff. I remember writing her Kelly a note, because we were constantly forecasting, like, what's the next story? What's the next story? I wrote her a note that was so naive, but it was like, is there something we could rent at Home Depot that would let us basically take a radar picture of what's below the earth? Mm-hmm. That must exist, right? This was 2011 or whatever. And I was like, right. There's got to be some piece of equipment that, but these are the kinds of things we were thinking.
Right.
And then, around that time, I guess a little after, through a mutual friend, I had a lunch with Aaron Kimmerly, who's the forensic anthropologist at USF. And I printed out everything I had written about Dozier, and brought a stack of paper to that lunch meeting at USF. And I gave it to her. And I was like, if you can do something with this, we're all ears. And I didn't hear from her for a long time. And I thought, it's too muddy. It's too big of an issue for somebody like this. And so I'm plotting my next move. And she reached out at some point in like 2012. And she was like, oh yeah, we've been up there a handful of times and we've started mapping the ground. And, she had already started work, and she was jumping the hurdles that she had to jump to do GPR on the cemetery.
Getting approval, which I heard was a whole mess. Yes.
Yeah. And the locals came out in opposition to her. And so I
have some questions about that for you as well.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, a lot of people within the local community, I've even seen your name specifically mentioned, because I've been on blogs and all the backwater websites and stuff looking at what they have to say. Yeah. And they think that what you and other journalists have done is a sensationalization that has taken advantage of the local community and all the good work that they've done for those young men. And I first want to ask, what do you think fuels these criticisms? And then secondly, how do you react to that sort of thing?
Yeah, what fuels it is it's very common. If you look at any place, any society, that where some bad event, negative event in history has happened that hasn't gotten the attention it deserved at the time, and when people later on of forward generations begin to try to bring about truth and reconciliation and justice, they try to bring those things to bear on these historic events. Then you find the stakeholders, the power holders in that community banding together to try to preserve their version of truth. It is what they believe, right? These power holders in Marianna believe that they did good by these kids. Mm-hmm. And there's no amount of evidence that you can put before them that will separate them from that idea, because these were bad kids and they came from all over the state, and Marianna had to deal with them. And we did it the best way we knew how. And it was their daddies and their granddaddies who were doing it. And to bring, to try to make them understand that maybe your granddaddy and your daddy and the people you sat by in church and the people that you learned from and the people that, cut your grass and painted your house and whatever, that those people might have marched off to their job at Dozier and sadistically tortured children. That's a hard thing for them to get their minds around. And so that's the explanation. And you see it mostly with like lynchings and civil rights abuses.
Which Marianna had plenty of history with that as well. If you look at Claude, Neal, and even some of their modern histories of that event are I read one account by a local man, who I shall not name, about the lynching of Claude Neal that said no one in Marianna knew about it until the next day. Right. I said, except the thousands of people who lynched him. Right. So it's
protectionism. It's a city of Southern charm, and there are a lot of people who have a financial stake in upholding that idea that this was just a good old Southern town, and we're good old fashioned people. But you brush away you peel the onion there, and you find some sadism and some barbarism not too far in the distant past. And so this opposition to discovering the truth is really opposition to coming to terms with the sins of the fathers. And I can understand it. And it's kind of humorous to me, even, to see them get all worked up and have their press conference that, where the 5 or 6 Chamber of Commerce Citizens of the Year badmouthed me and the Tampa Bay Times and other journalists. That was laughable in my mind. And that's kind of how I treated it. I wanted to always give the locals a fair shake. And I think if you look at our body of work, like we did, I tried very hard to talk to Troy Tidwell. I staked out his house for 4 hours one afternoon. I went to all of the places where people told me he ate. I eventually talked to his granddaughter, who, took tons of convincing, but eventually she went on the record and is in that first story in his defense. Nobody is all good. Nobody is all bad. And I wanted him to, be reflected in the right way. So I introduce elements in his life that I think make him human. He liked to dance the foxtrot, and he liked to flirt with the girls at the perfume counter at the mall in Dothan, and so on. And he loved his grandkids. He took them fishing and blah, blah, blah. But he also sadistically beat who knows how many young boys, violently. And so, this is as a body of work, I think it stands up. And I always challenged like Dale Cox, who I've had, I haven't talked to him in a couple of years, but I had a long relationship with him. It was, adversarial a lot of times, but sometimes we could just talk. Right up until he started threatening to sue the newspaper. But I always wanted to give him a fair shake. And so every story I did, I would at least reach out to him and ask for his comment on certain things. And he participated in some of them, and some of them he chose not to. Turns out he participated a lot of times when it stood to benefit him financially. Like he wouldn't talk to me about the Claude Neal lynching. And I did a story called The Spectacle, the Lynching of Claude Neal, about that whole deal. He wouldn't talk to me about that until he had a book on the Claude Neal lynching ready to go. And then he finally talked to me because it was press for him. And, whatever. But I got comfortable with the idea that like we were in pursuit of the truth. And early on, after a couple of stories, a former editor for the Times sent me an email, and he said something like, I'm glad to see that there are still journalists at the Times who are not afraid to crusade. And I wasn't comfortable with that word at that time. And I remember kind of pushing back from my desk a little bit and saying, is that what we're doing? Is this a crusade, But over the years, I got more comfortable with that idea because the truth was firm and there was no more guessing. I didn't have to say alleged abuse at the Florida School for Boys. Like I had seen the scars. And I had read the eyewitness accounts, and I had talked to 100 or more men who testified to this.
Identically. Yes, it's always the same story. Yeah.
So we stopped saying allegedly, this happened, right? And the closer you get to the understanding of the truth, and the more authority you get in terms of reporting. And so, it turns out we weren't barking up the wrong tree when we were trying to editorially and in newspaper stories ask questions about how many kids were buried in that cemetery. It turns out there were a hell of a lot more than 31. And the state was ready to let it rest. And we were just like, fuck you. We're not going to let this go again, because these kids deserve to be found. And the families that have always wondered, like the Glenn Varnados and the Ovell Krells and so forth, they've always wondered where their loved one is buried. They deserve to know, even if they've only got a couple of years left on earth. They deserve to have those remains and to be able to mourn for the first time.
Visit the grave of their relative and know which grave it is.
It's what separates us from animals. The privilege of honoring and recognizing the dead. And that I don't think maybe elephants do something similar, but I don't think any other species does that except for humans. But we return to the graves and we acknowledge that, and it's a part of our grief process. It's a part of our mourning and our remembrance. And to rob somebody of that is to rob somebody of their human rights. When a kid dies in custody, when anybody dies in custody, in the custody of the government, which is us, collectively us, the people that we elect and choose to lead us. If somebody dies in that situation, their loved ones get those remains. It's not the state that gets to decide how they're disposed of and how they're buried and how they're remembered. So that is a fundamental human right, and I'll believe that until I die. And we wanted to give that right to the people who stepped up to say, my loved one died in custody and we don't know where he's buried, but we want his remains back. And so we just went to bat for those people over and over and over again until it, finally worked out.
Wow. Yes, that is such an awesome point too, is that like the FDLE wanted to say, here's a 10-page report and we're going to put this to rest. We'll sort of acknowledge it, but we don't really need to dig up the past. And you guys were here saying, well, we do. This is necessary. I didn't know that you were the one who got USF on board and got Aaron Kimmerly on board with it. Can you share a little bit more about that experience and finding out, what was your reaction to finding out that there were far more bodies than initially reported?
Yeah, let me.
Unless I'm running up too much of your.
Oh, you're not. I want to show you there's a book. Hold on. So I never heard of this guy, but a guy called me. His name was John Jefferson. Now he is a friend. At the time, he was a stranger. He called me and he said, "I've written a novel based on your Dozier School stories." And he said, he explained that he's part of a writing team. His name is John Jefferson, but he writes with a guy named Bill Bass. Bill Bass was the godfather of forensic anthropology. He was the guy who started teaching it at the University of Tennessee and who founded the very first body farm in the United States, where they put corpses and watched them decompose and learn scientific things from there. Anyways, the two of them, this is them, by the way, they worked together, and John had just released this book called The Boneyard. And so he wanted to give me a copy of this book with the hopes that the Times might review it. So I was curious about, in that conversation, he said, and also there's a former student of Bill Bass's, my writing partners, who now teaches forensic anthropology at USF. Her name is Erin Kimmerly. Maybe she would be interested in this project. And he said he had called on her occasionally for like scientific stuff, because they try to keep this accurate scientifically, even though it's all, it's fictionalized. They use the real science, and the two main characters like forensic anthropologists and detectives and stuff. Anyway, so I told John, well, that'd be cool, because there were times when we would sort of run out of steam, because it's not my skill set to like find graves,
No.
And so it felt like that. We had just been asking these questions, and it didn't look like the state was going to reopen their investigation. And so we're sort of, running out of options. And so John set up this lunch meeting with Erin. Like I said, I gave her the documents, and she went to work on it almost immediately on her own, without telling me anything about it until later. And so, what was it like to learn? So interestingly, when they got cleared, and I've been writing about this, I owned this story. Like I'll tell you how much I own this story. Because this is a feat of reporting and it's how much I cared about it. I developed a source in the administration building at the Dozier School when it was still open.
Wow.
So this source would call me when anything happened and tell me how to get that information. It couldn't come from her, but she would say like, the superintendent and the regional DJJ manager just had a huge fight in the office, and I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I think the superintendent got fired, but they're going to give her the option of saying she resigned. And so I would get on the phone to Tallahassee, to the, media people at DJJ, and say, Frank Piniella, Frank, this has been, Mary Zahaski has either been fired or resigned, and I want the documents that she faxed your office, 14 minutes ago. And he would be like, I'm on my way home. I've already left the office. Then I would say like, well, Frank, if you know the open records laws in the state of Florida, if that document is within reach of any employee, then you have, 2 hours to get it to me. A lot of this I was making up because I don't know the law, but they don't either. Right. So you just play it. And so he would like turn around and go back to Tally and And sure enough, it all bared out. Or she would say, this source would say, like, there was an incident in Jefferson Cottage where a guard beat up a kid, and it happened on January 14th between 2 p.m. and 6 a.m. or whatever. And so I would call Tally and request the video surveillance of that cottage for that time period. And sure enough, we'd get it back, and there's some terrible abuse situation. So I got that close. Like, I knew what was going on there before Tallahassee knew. And it just allowed me to, to report with confidence and accuracy a lot of times, and to know what I was looking for. But we had been doing this for a long time. And at times we're the only media outlet writing about the Dozier School. Everybody else did their thing and left. We were just doing it day in and day out. And so Aaron finally got permission to dig, and they had set it all up. And the size of the size and scope of that project had grown to include like the university as a whole, which included the media relations arm of the university. And so when it came time to, they had decided they weren't going to let the press into this area. They were going to let a pool photographer and a pool videographer into the site to watch the exhumations. I lost my shit. I was like,
what is there? Yeah.
This is my story. Y'all wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't for me. I'm so hurt and angry. And Aaron had become a friend. And, and so she's saying, it's out of my control. I'm so sorry. They're running this, and it's, the legal team is now involved, and blah, blah, blah. So the day they started exhumations, I'm stuck over with the rest of the reporters, like all these Johnny-come-latelys on the other side of campus, waiting for them to come over and like do a press conference. And I don't get to see anything. I don't get to be there. And I'm just devastated by this and angry. And after the first press conference, the media liaison, this person that I'd been fighting with on the phone, I see her there, and I come up beside her, and I was like, Lara, she's going to tell you one more time how upset I am at y'all, and how I wish this could have happened differently. I should be there. And she was like, let me stop you. Look, when we leave to go back over, you just follow us. Don't let anybody see you. Come on over. So I get in, I talk myself into and then from then on, I sat graveside, like during the whole process, and, got the story every day and blah, blah, blah. So anyways, it became much, much bigger and more unwieldy at times. And, but they did what we thought they were going to do, which is turn up a lot more bodies than anybody knew were buried there, and to provide, most importantly, not closure, but like some sense of relief to some of these families that had been missing their loved ones' remains for years. That being there for the reburial, the repatriation, they call it, of Thomas Varnado, was one of the highlights of my life. To see his family so thankful, and 76 years after his death, they reburied him in the family plot in Plant City by his mother and his brother. It's just better than any award, journalism award or whatever. That was just a neat thing to be there for.
Right. Like you're getting this real palpable impact. And speaking of that, I wanted to say, outside of just, which obviously there was this huge direct impact, like Orville Krell's story really just is so incredible to me with her brother. But beyond just the families in particular, do you think there were broader effects on the juvenile justice system in Florida, outside of Florida, after Dozier, once this all came to light? Through y'all's efforts, of course.
It's really hard to say. I think that, did it like warn people away from abuse? Probably not. I think anytime you have stronger people, more powerful people, more grown people, coupled with weaker people, the stronger people are going to abuse the weaker people. And, you see it even in advanced societies. The thing it's done is it's allowed me to talk about this a bunch, and I present 20, 30 times a year to a wide range of groups. And a lot of times at the end, one of the questions will be, what can we do? We know this place is closed, but there's still a lot of kids in juvenile detention in places that we don't even know exist. Where are they? What can we do? And I tell people, like, first of all, if you're serious about this, ask for some records. Have fun with it. As Florida citizens, we're entitled to public records. We can view them, we can see them. It's a great part about being a citizen of the state of Florida. A lot of times juvenile records will be confidential, but you can get a sense of what's going on. Ask for those records. Take a visit. See if there's any way you can volunteer. Can you mentor kids? Can you just drop in once in a while and, get a tour of the campus? Think about it when you vote. It's not something a lot of people ask about anymore. How do you feel about juvenile justice in our area? But that should be an issue that we're all concerned with. And I think it's one of the most important issues we deal with. Last I checked, the minimum requirements for being a direct care provider in a juvenile detention facility in the state of Florida was a high school diploma or equivalent, and the willingness to make like $17 an hour or whatever the minimum thing the state is paying. Right. You don't need, and you got to pass an online course, but you don't need anything more than that. And
psych evaluation or
not when I was looking. And so and what a pivotal role, maybe no more important role in society. We like to think that teachers are very important. Of course they are, but this is, the direct care provider for, and that's the guy these kids see every day, day in and day out, live with them oftentimes. That person has a chance to reshape and make better the lives of 13, 14, 15-year-olds, these boys typically that are in their formative years. And a lot of times they are, the guys who are doing that are the dregs of society. They don't give a shit about, they're there, to get a paycheck, and maybe because their daddy or granddaddy worked in the same facility, they're not there to make kids' lives better, and they're not trained to do that. And
they're not concerned with it. They're concerned with controlling them, not bettering them.
And some of them are, but it's anybody's guess how what percentage really cares about kids. But I think by and large, if you're setting it up like that, you're just going to get corrections officers, and so I tell people that it's given me a chance to talk about it more, and who knows if these people follow through with that, but maybe it puts juvenile justice on the radar of some folks. Maybe, Colson Whitehead's book, The Nickel Boys, which won the Pulitzer, maybe that puts it on people's radar, makes them give a passing thought to juvenile justice and how that experience can change lives, and for better or for worse. And then there's this societal, cultural shift that's sort of started happening at the same time with civil citations, where we're realizing now, like we realized in the 60s that corporal punishment was dumb and wasn't working. We're realizing now that incarceration for kids is not working and hasn't been working, and that it's a much better alternative, cheaper to taxpayers, better for society, not to remove the kid from their situation and place them in a detention facility, but instead to have them monitored, get them connected to the mental health counseling they need and the services they need, try to repair the damage these kids experienced in the past, and by and large, try to leave them in their communities so they're local community can provide direct care, and it's not some distant prison guard that's doing that.
Right. They're not picked up and plucked away and isolated from everyone they've ever met, because I think we don't really think about how traumatic of an experience that is. And they were sending very young kids to this place, and then just putting them under the complete control of, like you said, someone who's probably not qualified to have that kind of control. Right. I've heard a lot of justification too, that the men who worked there during the 60s and so on were often war veterans and had just experienced these horrific things. And so to them, a beating like the one they would have given wasn't, their warped sense of reality. It wasn't severe punishment to them. But even in light of those defenses, it's still a situation where we need to have equipped people deployed into these situations. Look, their peers would have experienced the same things. And I'm thinking specifically of a guy named Vic Prinzi, who had been involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion, had spent some years in the military, and he took over as a football coach in 1961 at the Dozier School, bore witness to some of these beatings accidentally, like was looking for a kid and walked into the White House when he heard some scuffling in there and found, if you believe his testimony, posthumous testimony, he'd made some tapes that I wrote about long after his death. If you believe that, he found a kid being raped and tortured, raped and abused. That defense doesn't hold up if your peers who would have witnessed the same sort of wartime experiences that you did object to that sort of behavior. Are horrified by that behavior. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I agree completely. And the sexual exploitation and abuse, that's a whole other issue that goes into not really policing who you're hiring, because that was something that I heard repeatedly, was these boys were almost sold out, to whoever at the highest price, because they didn't have anyone there advocating for them. Maybe a lot of them didn't have parents, and they were terrified. So I definitely am making no attempt to excuse any of that sort of thing, but I do think it's interesting to see how these people, Troy Tidwell, great example. He is known for being this just compassionate person in his community. And, the people who go to church with him and his grandkids will just talk about how kind-hearted of a person he is. But you've got Bryant Middleton or all of these other people who are vividly recalling these horrific beatings that he gave them. So human nature is very interesting, and the complexity of human behavior. So,
yeah.
So something else I wanted to ask you about, I saw your subsequent work on police shootings in the state of Florida. I would like to think, I guess, that the work you did on Dozier had some kind of influence on the subsequent work. It seems like you had a lot of interest in the criminal justice system after this, and it sounds like even before. What was doing that work like?
I'm not sure. Well, yeah, maybe it was related to Dozier, I guess. But that started after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, I think. I had just read an editorial in the Washington Post that said that nobody keeps track of police shootings. And this was new to me. And I had just finished a project that was like a dumb little thing about the state fair was opening in Tampa. And I wanted to know how many people get injured every year at the state fair. And are there rides that are more prone to injure people than other rides? Like, is a tilt-a-whirl especially dangerous because it feels dangerous? So it turns out the state government has a little bureau that investigates every reported injury at every theme park and fair in the whole state of Florida. And there are lots and lots of them. So anytime somebody reports an injury from one of these, they actually go out and they interview people and they look at the medical records and they examine the ride. And, it's a safety function. But I asked the state for like 5 years worth of reports anytime somebody was injured like that. And they turned them over almost immediately. And
in a carnival accident of some kind, right?
And they were thorough, and, some of them 60 or 80 pages. And I was like, huh. So that happened right before I learned, after the Michael Brown shooting, that nobody counts police shootings in Florida. And I was like, but we pay so much attention to carnival injuries. Like, how these are sworn law enforcement officers, regulated in a bunch of different ways, but nobody's keeping track of the number of times that they shoot citizens. And I call FDLE. I'm like, is this true? And they're like, yeah, nobody, locally they do, but nobody.
No oversight.
We don't. There's, yeah. So I'm ranting about this and cursing up a storm in this staff meeting. And my editor, Bill Duryea, was like, do it, stop talking about it and do it. And I was like, but I don't want to do it. That's a lot of work,
For one person. Yeah, you said there was a whole department for the interstate fair and theme park stuff. So, I mean, one person doing police shootings, which I'm going to venture a guess that there's probably about just as many or more than, with the injuries than with the carnival stuff, probably more.
Oh, do you know how many police agencies there are in Florida?
Oh no, I would guess probably more than 1,000.
400.
Oh,
that's all the way from like your college, university police force to like Miami-Dade Police Department.
Okay.
So 400, but that required sending a records request to 400 people at 400 different agencies, right. Specifying and then working with each of those agencies to make sure they got the request, that they're working to fulfill it, that they know it is, legal for me to request that, and they've got to produce it, and then getting an accurate count of those reports. Then once we get all those reports in, and there were 831 shootings in 6 years, 130 a year. When we got all those reports in, then we were like, what do we do with this? And we decided that we were going to analyze each one of them, go seek any media coverage there was about them, seek any civil cases, and then seek any criminal cases if the police were charged or whatever. So this became a huge thing. And long story short, it was about 3 years of work from making that first records request to like writing a 10,000 word story called Why Cops Shoot. But we did, we were able to count for the very first time 829 or 831 shootings in that 6 year period. 40% of people shot by police were Black. That compares with about 17% of the population of Florida. And then we built this impressive database that gives you circumstantial information for all of those shootings. Was the person in the commission of a crime? Had he attacked a police officer? Was it an accident? Was the SWAT team involved? All of this. Was he running from the cops?
Was he armed?
Yeah, all this stuff. And then you can, we just sort of drew some conclusions from that, and then really tried to delve both into the loss side of it, that meant connecting with this group I didn't know existed before, this group of Black mothers who have lost kids and husbands to police violence. And then also trying to understand from a police perspective, like mentally, what's going on when they squeeze that trigger, and why does it happen so frequently? And are there things that can be done better? Are there policies that could be put in place that better train police for dealing with people in dynamic situations or whatever? So anyways, we did that in one big attempt. And yeah, maybe it was related, but maybe all my stuff is related. I don't know.
Sure, right. It does seem like a lot of your work. You wrote several books too. A Shot in the Moonlight, Grandma Gatewood's Walk. All of those seem, well, especially A Shot in the Moonlight. It seems to connect with your interest in history and in human nature and what makes people do terrible things, and how everyday people react to these extraordinary circumstances. And have you considered, I wanted to ask, writing a book on Dozier? I know some of your reporting, Colson Whitehead credited with, inspiring his book Nickel Boys, but have you thought about doing a book or any more work on Dozier?
I've thought about it occasionally, but my agent doesn't like the idea. She feels like it is a very sad story and she doesn't think it'll sell very well. And so she's convinced me that I should just leave it alone. But that's not to say that the future won't change my mind in some way.
Sure, no promises or anything. But so I wanted to ask about your recent endeavor with Tampa Axios or Tampa Bay Axios, which and how did that come about? Where did this change from the Times to Axios come from?
Well, I left the Times in 2017 to finish a book, and then realized that the business side of doing the books was sustainable, and I didn't need necessarily a newspaper job, and I wasn't looking. But in October or November of last year, Axios came to me. They had plans to launch a Tampa Bay newsletter and needed somebody who knew this area really well, and was a good guy and a good writer to anchor it. And so I again wasn't looking, wasn't interested, but they made me a fantastic offer, and I was sold on the company. It is a new and exciting endeavor and a cool thing to be a part of. And we hired another person to help in the Tampa Bay area, Celine Sanfelice, who's a University of Tampa grad who spent a couple of years in at a newspaper in Maryland. She was at the Capital Gazette, in fact, which was the newsroom that got shot up by that guy about 2 years ago, a guy who shot 5 of her newsroom colleagues. She was in the newsroom that day.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So she's got, even just in a few years, she's gotten some pretty incredible experience, having survived that craziness and tragedy. And so she's stoked to be back in Tampa. She actually lives in St. Pete, but yeah, we rip off a newsletter every day, 5 days a week, with the 5 or 6 things, that most important things that we feel like you need to know to have a conversation or get by in the Tampa Bay area. And it's pretty cool so far.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, that's been in the last, how long has it been now that you've been doing that?
Well, I started with them in November, but we launched the newsletter January 25th, I think, something like that.
Super, super recently. Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. So are there any current projects other than obviously getting that off the ground that you're working on right now?
Well, Shot in the Moonlight came out January 25th. At the same time this newsletter was launched. And so I'm still doing some press and book talks associated with that. So I'm going to hit pause and take a breath. The Axios work has been so hot and heavy getting this thing started and getting it out of the gate that I feel like with that and the release of Shot in the Moonlight, it's been important for me just to focus on those things. So I'll probably pitch Jane on a new project maybe later on this year. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'll find it.
Right. I'm sure something will come up. There's always fascinating new topics that just sort of drop in your lap. If you have, and it seems like you have that mindset where you're always looking at, even the sunflower field story is a great example. That's not something that most people would think is a big news story, but you made it into one. So with that mindset, I'm sure you'll find
all the time. In fact, Celine and I we watched my daughters play a rock show downtown Tampa last night. And then we walked over to a place called Hotel Bar, and I was eavesdropping as the bartender told some other customers that a few weeks ago, someone stole a pillow off their, there's a little couch in their welcome area, like the waiting area while you're waiting on a table. Someone took one of their velvet pillows. He just walked out with it. Nobody noticed. Then they realized it was gone. Well, the owner of the bar is a retired detective. And so the first thing he does is find the credit cards that are the possibilities that would have been this person in this time.
Pool.
Found the security video, realized it's a female and what she was wearing. And then used the credit cards, started calling the owners of the credit cards. One of the numbers came back to this female's mother. And he was like, Yeah, your daughter walked out of our bar with a pillow the other night. And so the mom has now turned the girl in. They got the pillow back. And she, and I don't know what's next, whether they're going to bring charges or whatever. But
I
anyways,
was going to
the whole
ask.
time as I'm listening to this, I'm like, it's a great story. I would love to retell this, the case of
Yes.
the missing pillow.
Yes, it's really funny. And I think newsworthy, especially when we have so much just like terrible news. I mean, not like terribly written, but terribly in the content of what's going on in the world. It's nice to have something it doesn't keep you up at night.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there were a few more questions I wanted to ask you just about your plans for the future, for your career, for your family, and where your next steps. I know you said you're taking a pause right now, so I don't mean like, tomorrow, but just in life. Are you headed towards retirement? Are you hoping to get out of journalism and just do books? It's a big, I know it's a big question.
Yeah, no, I will always have a foot in the journalism world. It's what I do. It's what I am. I'm a writer. And so I don't foresee myself doing anything else. I'm 43. I've been divorced now after 20 years of marriage, I've been divorced now for about 4 years. I have 2 daughters in high school who will soon graduate. Right now, I have met a woman in San Diego who I've known actually since 2001 or 2002, but I've never been in a relationship with her until this Christmas. And I think she's either going to eat my heart raw or she's going to be my wife one of these days. Wow. That gives me a great amount of hope for the future. I'm in the early stages of development of love, and it feels very nice. We'll see how that plays out. But I think maybe it's time for I'm starting to think about a second act. Like who knows what that means? But
more kids.
Maybe it's not out of the question. This pandemic has helped everyone reassess in certain ways, and for me, that reassessment has been, just facing my own mortality. And the math is very clear. Like I probably have 40 years left. I'm probably on the backside of life at the age of 43, which is a weird thing to stare in the face of. But maybe I want to leave some more life behind. And that might mean having some, I don't know, having some kids, at a minimum, some dogs or something.
Hey, maybe some horses, the whole cowboy dream. Let's go back to that.
Not a bad idea. We still have that place. My grandparents are both dead and gone, but we still have that place in Slick. So yeah, it's in the realm of possibilities.
There you go. Yeah. Going back out west. I love out west. I'm a bit of a cowgirl myself. So I have to say, if you took that path, I would be definitely a big supporter of that. I wanted to ask one more thing too. What are your hopes, not for your future, but for the future of Truth and Reconciliation for Dozier? Do you think there's still work left to be done, or is it time to move on from this story?
There is work to be done. These guys are dying at a very rapid pace lately. Yeah. I think if the state can do, like, apology is not enough. We know this, looking at groups that have been wronged in the past. Apology helps, I guess, but a lot of times it doesn't correct all the negative impacts of for these guys, those couple of years that they spent in custody. The thing that would help, and this is difficult for anybody who controls the state purse strings to hear, but the thing that would help them is some form of reparation, some form of monetary benefit. And who knows how much that is or how it's doled out. But a lot of these guys, $5 or 10 grand would go a long way toward giving them a better shot at enjoying their golden years. And that's not a lot of money, but I hate that the conversation has sort of ended with the formal apology from the state a couple of years ago. At the same time, there are groups that have been wronged in the past that haven't even come as close as these guys to getting that. They haven't gotten an apology, for instance. I think at a minimum, the conversation should not die. That we should continue to talk about this and study ways to right historic wrongs, not just for the Dozier guys, but for everybody who's been wronged in the past.
Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly my view on this thing. It was something I grew up around, and now coming back when I wanted to write my first real substantial piece of writing, it was just what I came back to. But I think it really encapsulates a lot of broader themes in history. There's so many things that you want to go back and vindicate that cannot be vindicated. People, died before people who went to Dozier died before anyone ever found out what happened to them, and before they knew that other people knew, and before they maybe could even confront it themselves. And that's just something that we have to, at the end of the day, accept, but we should be talking about. We should be having these conversations, and we should stay looking, like you do, for new conversations to have, and new topics and new issues that need to be addressed. So,
the only similarly organized group that ever got reparations, and I think this is true in all of U.S. history, were the survivors, or the descendants of the survivors of the massacre at what is it called? Right up US 19.
Ocoee?
No.
Rosewood?
Rosewood, yeah.
Right.
They got a monetary reward in the late 1990s, and it was just because the political stars aligned just right. And I forget what the politics were at the time, but it worked out. And that is a part of healing. That is a part of societal, cultural healing, to give these people their due, I think. And, Joe and Sarah taxpayer, I don't think missed any money because the survivors of this terrible race massacre got $100,000 each or whatever it was. But the state did right by them. And that should happen in the case of Ocoee. That should happen in the case of the Dozier School. And for every group that was historically wronged.
Oh, yeah. And it's unfortunate. We'll see how far we can get with that. I do believe that there was an effort to provide reparations to Dozier alums that failed, that a bill that died.
A couple of them, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I do think that just staying on that effort and just making more, because I still talk to Floridians. I'm from the Panhandle, so I guess locally maybe there's some bias, but there's still so many Floridians that I talk to about that haven't ever heard of Dozier. So that's sort of how I know that the work isn't done yet. And that's why I'm trying to at least inform my peers and stuff by writing this paper. And I'm really just trying to understand with my paper how we remember Dozier. Mm-hmm. And why we remember it the way we do, and who shaped that. Mm-hmm. And also Sorry?
Have you been to the campus lately?
I did. I went, I kind of snuck into the campus because I was scared the police station's on the grounds. So I drove in. I wanted to get some bricks to just keep that, since they were demolishing the buildings, and I saw the White House. It was kind of nighttime, semi-nighttime when I went, dusk. So I was with my flashlight going through all the buildings and stuff, but they are demolishing it now.
Did you go over to the cemetery side?
I could not find the cemetery when I went.
Hard to find, yeah. But what they've done it pretty nicely. If you're back up there, it's on the other side of Penn Avenue. And you sort of have to go past, there's a jail right there. And the cemetery is almost directly behind the jail. So you sort of drive up this drive that is on the perimeter of the parking lot of the jail, and then sort of turn and go up into the woods. But they've placed, markers out there. They've fenced off the area. They're maintaining it in a way that it was never maintained. There's a nice paved sidewalk around it and some benches that you can sit on for reflection. And they replanted the old mulberry tree that's grown out there forever and ever. Anyhow, it's so much better upkept. It looks better manicured now than it ever was. So, I mean, it looks like a very small cemetery now. And before it was like a field with crosses. I don't know.
Right. It just totally forgotten. Yeah. I wanted to ask. Oh, I heard that they were planning on building a new facility where Dozier was that's supposed to help disabled students. I believe it's a school for the autistic. I don't know if you've heard about that or if you have any particular, I know I said I was going to end this interview and then I'm thinking of more things, but have you heard about that? And what are your thoughts on putting, arguably an even more at-risk group in the same facility that these kids were in?
I have heard about that. I don't think land matters very much. It's not as though I believe that place is haunted or there's some sort of energy. And I don't know that not to be the case either, but I think a facility like that deserves public scrutiny and deserves to be monitored by the state and by the people. And, if we all do a better job, then we can prevent bad things from happening to kids. There have been a lot of different ideas proposed for that land, from a guy who said he was going to erect a billboard saying, "Welcome to Florida's Auschwitz," right there on I-10, to a guy who was interested in having like a sports camp type facility. So this is just the latest iteration of that. Some of those buildings deserve to stand forever, I think. They're knocking them down left and right. I was up there at Christmas time and so much of it's being destroyed, but I don't know. I hope not all of this is erased. We know it in our collective memory now, thank goodness. But I think it's still important to have some markers of, the pain that place caused and the notoriety that it gained over the years, like the White House. I hope that doesn't come down. I thought,
They had it marked when I went, which sounds like it was around maybe a little bit after you went. Like I went in early January, I think, and it was marked "Do not demolish the White House." That was the only thing that I saw that was marked not to be demolished. There were a few buildings still up, but yeah, a lot of it was just rubble. And it, of course, as a history person, knowing how old the school is, and even though a lot of it's horrible, just that there's a lot of history there, it was sort of, it pulled at my heartstrings a little bit to see that just being erased. So I have the same hope that they'll continue to not demolish the White House and keep that there, because it is emblematic of what those men went through, and it shouldn't just be erased and built over. So,
yeah.
Okay, so one last thing. Do you additional statements, reflections, closing remarks, anything that you want to say before I close out this interview formally?
Think for a second. There have been some really good men who showed a remarkable amount of courage and energy in the years that they should have been enjoying themselves to bring this to light. And I think specifically of my friend Robert Straley, who died about 2 years ago from cancer. Robert was a quiet, kind man who never wanted to bask in the glow of the public spotlight, but who would not let this go, who wanted justice for himself and for his brethren, the White House boys, and did everything he could, working backstage, saving, maintaining a website, going out of pocket for new computers and hard drives in order to help with that sort of maintenance. Untold numbers of hours spent on the phone with men who just stumbled across his webpage and called the number and had a story to tell. Untold hours researching, helping me find information, running down leads, talking to people in Mariana who had secrets or who remembered their daddy hiding a kid in a barn on this date and this year or whatever. And he's one of many, but those guys are heroic. Their efforts to bring this to light, and like I always said to them, I'm getting paid for this, right? This is my job. Y'all are not. You're doing this out of the goodness of your heart and because you realize that this story needs to be told. But it's important for me when I talk about this story to honor those guys like Jerry Cooper and even Glenn Varnado and Ovell Krell and many James DeKnight and Bryant Middleton and Don Stratton and Stu Kruger and William Haynes and on, Dick Cologne, Roger Kaiser. They just wouldn't let it go. And this is their story. And I feel fortunate to have met many of them. Some of them are assholes and are a huge thorn in my side and would bother me on weekends when I didn't want to think about Dozier. But they are the reason that we all know about this now, and it wouldn't have been told without them, without their courage.
Right. And I completely agree. There was so much personal sacrifice too, in remembering this and then in bringing it back to our collective memory. And I know that could not have been easy to have to relive all of this and dig it back up. But I think it had this huge impact on just the way that I think it really did impact the way that we as Floridians see our juvenile justice system. And it made us stop and look back and think about the way that we do things and the way that we treat youth offenders and the consequences of that treatment. So I have just bottomless respect. And it is unfortunate that Robert Straley, to name one, or Michael O. McCarthy, that they passed before this project and I wasn't able to interview them. So it's good that they left such a great record of all of this and all of their efforts. So
for sure.